Welcome to another fruitful webinar conducted and led by the EYSAC Research Academy. Today we have an important topic that will be led by one of our mentors and friends of the EYSAC Research Academy, Professor Wim Celine. He is a professor at the Ghent University Hospital, specialized in oncological surgery, peritoneal cancers, and soft tissue tumors. He's also the head of the GI department and experimental surgery unit of Ghent University Hospital. As mentioned, he is the mentor of EYSAC steering committee, and he's also our good friend who has been very supportive of our initiatives. And also, I would like to introduce my co-chair, Professor Michel Rivoire, who is also the head of the surgery, teaching and experimental surgery unit of Saint-Léon-Béard in France. So welcome, and Wim, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you, Carmela, for this kind introduction, and thank you to EYSAC for giving me this opportunity to share with you some experiences, both as a writer of grant applications and of a reviewer as well. I will now share my screen. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah,
okay,
perfect.
So let's go. I have no disclosures. However, I have some experience in reviewing of grant proposals. I am a regular reviewer for the Dutch Cancer Society and the Queen Wilhelmina Fund, the Flemish League Against Cancer, the Foundation Against Cancer, which is a Belgian national association, the Israel Science Foundation, the National Medical Research Council of Singapore, and then last but not least, for the SSO, I have been reviewing grant proposals for two funding channels, the Clinical Investigator Awards and the Young Investigator Awards. So I must say that I read and score quite a number of grant proposals per year. And myself, I have been quite successful as well in obtaining funding, I must say, regional, so Flemish grants, national grants, and I think throughout the last 10 to 12 years, I have attracted about 6 to 7 million euros in funding for translational and clinical research projects. So this is an overview of the next 40 minutes. So I will highlight how you can find an appropriate funding channel. I will discuss how you should prepare for a grant proposal. And then, of course, the major focus of this evening will be on how to draft a proposal, how to structure a proposal, and then some very practical tips and tricks on how you should draft all of this. And then I will finish with some thoughts on, what if your proposal is funded, what now? And also, what if you're in the opposite scenario? What if your proposal is rejected? What should you do and what can you do? So the impression is sometimes prevailing that surgeons are not that interested in applying for grant proposals and not that successful, but in fact, that's not really true. And here you can see a very recent paper from the Journal of the American College of Surgeons, where you see that between 2010 and 2020, there was really a significant increase in the number of surgeons that got funded. This is, of course, the US situation. There are no data on the success rate or the intensity of grant applications by surgeon scientists in Europe. But I have the impression, and seeing the enthusiasm and the activities both in EYSAC, but also in the UK, there are collaborative young surgeons, etc., etc. So I have the impression that in Europe, we see the same positive evolution. So where to look for sources of funding? Well, of course, your own institution, your own hospital, your own university, no doubt, will have funding channels. There are regional funding channels, such as the Flemish Cancer Foundation here in Belgium. And I guess in many countries that have a federal structure, such as Catalonia, etc., there might be regional funding agencies or funding opportunities available. When talking about international funding, of course, the main source of interest is the European Commission. They have the ERC grants, they have Horizon 2020, there's now the new Beating Cancer Plan, there is the EURTC, etc., etc. And maybe it's interesting for you to know that within the board of ESSO, we have tried to weigh a little bit on the texts and the calls that are coming out for the Beating Cancer Plan. And in fact, we have been successful because one of the pieces of advice that we have formulated from within ESSO was that there should be more opportunities for funding for surgical research. And in fact, this was taken over literally in the new versions of the Beating Cancer Plan. So we hope that there will be specific calls that are really targeted on local regional treatment and on surgical treatment in the setting of oncology, of course. Then there are the charities and the foundations. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, the Susan Komen Foundation, which of course are based in the US. In Europe, there is, and in fact in Belgium, there's the Anti-Cancer Fund, which has a strong focus on repurposing of cancer and on cancers that are difficult to treat, such as cancer of the pancreas, brain cancer, etc. But they have a very appealing website, and I would advise you to have a look there. The Anti-Cancer Fund, ACF, you can find their website quite easily using Google. Partnerships with industry are, of course, possible, but I would say that this is probably not a priority for starting faculty in surgical oncology, because yeah, I think it's important that you keep your independence, and that it's better not to start with projects that are really funded in a setting of a kind of contract research. So there are a few scholarly societies that give interesting information on potential sources of funding. This is from the website of the ESMO, which you are well aware of probably, and they have a nice overview of funding opportunities in a whole list of European countries, but in North America as well, and even in Asia and Australia. So you can have a look there. And here you see for Belgium listed the Foundation Against Cancer. In the UK, there's a similar website available, this funding finder. You see the website there. I have given you the PDF of the slides, so you can look it up if you want. There you can find an overview of the funding that is available in the UK. Regarding the funding that is available from the European Commission, there is this website that you can have a look at. You see there are the ERC grants with all the details, the Marie Curie grants, the Horizon 2020, etc., etc. And so the final calls for the Beating Cancer Plan will probably be made publicly available in the weeks and the months to come. So have a look at the European Commission website to look for opportunities for multi-center and collaborative grants. What is also interesting is that there is this organization called ECRIN. It's the European Clinical Research Infrastructure Network. You can see the website listed there. And what they in fact do is offer a kind of a platform to organize multi-centric clinical trials. Using either devices, and you know there's now a whole novel regulation that is in place in Europe for the use of medical devices and the clinical studies using medical devices, but also for medicinal products, the so-called medicinal products, but these are of course pharmaceuticals that are being tested in clinical studies. So a very useful site if you consider organizing or coordinating a clinical trial with multiple sites within Europe. The TransScan channel is quite interesting, and I must say that we have now very recently submitted a surgical oncology proposal within this TransScan channel. It's focused on cancer. The calls are different from year to year, but now the focus is on immunotherapy and targeting the tumor microenvironment. I'm pleased to say that we got to the second round and we have now submitted the full proposal and we're waiting for an answer. But I think this is also a very interesting opportunity for surgical oncologists to participate in these TransScan calls. The budget is a little bit less impressive. For instance, for collaboration between 5 centers, 5 research units, you can get a total amount of about 1.5 million euros. So compared with the Horizon 2020 funding, it's of course a little bit less, but anyway, this is a nice channel to get novel ideas funded. So that was some information on how you can find funding opportunities. And once you have decided for a funder, how should you prepare for writing a grant? Well, first and foremost, you should, of course, be skilled, and you should have or acquire the skills to write a proposal and to know what you're doing and what you're going to do. There are many courses, there are boot camps that you can follow. I will give an example later, but there is information out there, and there are courses that you can follow that really focus on grant writing. You should, of course, be very familiar with all the details of the call. Am I eligible? Is my topic eligible? What is the scope of the call? Is translational research admittable? Is it only basic science? Is it clinical studies? What is the total amount that is funded? What type of costs can be funded? What are the deadlines? That's, of course, crucial information. Is it a one-stage call or a two-stage call? What are the contact details? If you have a question, who should I contact? What are the priorities of the funding agency? Is the focus on novelty? Is the focus on benefit for the patients? This will be different, of course, according to the nature of the funding agency and whether or not it's a charity, for instance, whether or not it's focused on a certain type of cancer, etc., etc. You should be familiar with the review process, and so how is it reviewed, your proposal? Is it a purely internal jury? Is it external referees? When can you expect the news? Is there a possibility to resubmit, etc., etc. The advice that, of course, is very important to give to people who have no experience at all and write their first grant proposal is, of course, to read some successful proposals. That's obvious, and that's something we do regularly here within the university and within the faculty. We exchange successful grants that we have. If they are no longer confidential and the grant is finished, the work is finished, then there's really no problem to share your successful proposals with your younger colleagues so that they can learn from how you have done it. And of course, it's interesting to talk to people who got the grants awarded and to see what their experience was and how they did it and how they got successful. And this is not always relevant, but it's sometimes nice to know who the reviewers will be and what their expertise will be. I will come back to that later, but the reviewers are rarely really experts in the field that your grant is about. And so if you know, for instance, that your proposal will be reviewed not by a surgeon, but by an oncologist or by a gastroenterologist, then of course, this is interesting information and you should use this for your benefit when writing your proposal. So preparation is everything, I would say. This is one of these workshops that you can follow. It's not, of course, not really literally on grant writing, but on methods in clinical cancer research. This is the 2021 call. There will be a call, no doubt, this year, but I think for the well-known reasons, there are some delays. I have sent a junior colleague to that workshop, and I must say it's quite interesting. And so if you consider to apply for a clinical grant, then this is really the way to go, and to make sure that you are an expert in the methods at least, and this kind of workshop can learn all the skills. This is attended or supervised by statisticians, by methodologists, epidemiologists. So it's really a very good and interesting workshop to follow if you want to make a proposal for a clinical cancer study. So what should now be the general structure of a grant proposal? Well, for large projects like European grants, Horizon 2020 grants, other large grants, it's interesting to have an acronym and a logo. And of course, you should be careful with acronyms and make sure that it's not funny, or do not overdo it in the acronyms. And a logo, it's interesting to have that on your website, for instance, because major grants usually have a website where their logo is used, also in all communication, in the email signatures, etc., etc. There should be an abstract, there should be an introduction and a background, there should be a statement of need. This is really important. Reviewer, why is this topic important, and why is it important that you give me the money and that this research can be done, and what's in it for society, and what's in it for the cancer patient, and what is the real need. A statement of novelty is, of course, important. Novel proposals, novel approaches are always preferred, but watch out for the Me Too movement. Not in the sense that you may think of, but in the sense of everyone's doing now artificial intelligence and machine learning in medicine. So yeah, let's do it too. So try to avoid that, and try to give the impression that you want to do something new because everyone's doing it. So try to be original. The goals and the aims should be delineated. The methods, of course, should be written down in some detail, but I'll come back to that later. You should fill out the budget. Again, you should look at the guidelines of the funding agency. Usually there is some kind of tool available where you can fill in the different budget posts and the different kind of costs. This is usually personnel and then working costs, consumables, laboratory animals, antibodies, etc., etc. Sometimes there is a budget possible for equipment, like for a microscope or other types of equipment, but this is not that common, I must say. And then many grants need some supplements, like your CV, your publication lists, a personal statement, letters of endorsement. In the US with the NIH, this is quite common, that you need a letter of endorsement from your chief of department or another leading figure in the institution. So this is an example of a logo that we devised and an acronym that we devised. This was a proposal that we submitted for Horizon 2020 on PIPAC, and we called it PC Impact, so improved outcomes for peritoneal carcinomatosis using PIPAC. We made it to the second round, and then unfortunately in the second round we got on the reserve list because there were too many COVID proposals and COVID research that needed funding. But outside of the COVID era, we certainly would have made it. But so this is an example of a logo that you can quickly have designed by a professional graphic specialist. So the format is important and the content is important, but don't spend enough time on the format. Make sure that it looks nice, that there are no mistakes, no spelling mistakes, that everything's clear, that you use a consistent font and not Arial on one page and then Times on the second page. Everything should be perfect. And so one of the common mistakes that I notice is that people don't comply with the instructions. The instructions are usually very clear. If you have 6 pages, you have 6 pages. If you have 12 pages, you have 12 pages. If the font size must be 12, then don't use 11. And usually if there is no font size specified, then you should prefer a font that has a so-called serif, such as the Times, Times New Roman, which seems to be easier to read than the fonts without the serif, such as the one used here on this PowerPoint slide. So Calibri or Arial, and they have no serifs and they are a little bit more difficult to read. And so for writing a grant proposal, Times New Roman is really best, and then a font size of 12. And again, most reviewers will not be specialists in your field, will not be experts in that field. So you should not use jargon and technical details and go into details of antibodies and very complex methods that you will use. And don't do that. You will irritate the reviewers, you will bore the reviewers because they don't understand what you're talking about, and you get lost in the details. So it's a completely different style of writing compared to the writing of a manuscript. Excessive use of abbreviations, that's really very annoying. So if there's an abbreviation that you will use only once or twice in your whole proposal, just spell it out and don't use abbreviations. And specifically in the abstract, don't use abbreviations. And then a golden rule, a figure tells more than 1,000 words. So the best proposals are those who have figures and or tables to illustrate what you want to do. And then of course, make sure that the figures are excellent and that they are in a high resolution, and a high resolution means at least 300 dots per inch. And that's a unit of resolution, dots per inch, at least 300 for color figures. Make sure that they are readable, that the legend is readable, that the color schemes are readable for colorblind people. That may sound a strange piece of advice, but 15% of the male population is colorblind. So take that into account when choosing color schemes. Of course, don't give the impression that you are careless and that there is sloppy writing. If I see typos, grammar errors, stuff like that, I will be very unlikely to regard a proposal favorably, even if the content is perfect. A reviewer will argue, if they don't care, why should I care? If you don't care about flawless writing, then the reviewers will not care to give you a good score. And the best way to avoid that kind of errors is having your proposal read by someone else. Because if you read it, you reread it, you reread it 4, 5, 6, 7 times, there's some psychological mechanism that will make sure that you will miss the same typo over and over again. So have your proposal read by an independent person, by a colleague, by your partner, or whoever has the time and the energy to do that. And of course, what you can do, and this is often done for the more major grants, is to engage a professional grant writer or a medical writer. I must say that my experience is not that positive with grant writers and medical writers. But yeah, it depends, of course, from the specific funding channel, and maybe it also depends on your expertise, your own background. But for me, this was not really a useful addition to the grant writing process. This is an example of the type of instructions that you can get. And this is for a Horizon 2020 application, where you see here the detailed instructions on how long it should be, on the font that you should use, the size of the font. It's here Times New Roman, should be at least 12. So you have these instructions, and then of course you should comply with them literally. So you should comply with all the demands of the grants, not only regarding the format, but also regarding the content. If they want a maximum of 3 aims in your proposal, then don't write down 4 aims, because then you automatically will kill your application and it will not make it to the next round. So what about the style of a proposal? First of all, there is a fine line between confidence and arrogance. You should be confident and you should sound confident and not uncertain. And writing, yeah, we hope that, and this may be, and this could perhaps show this, and we hope. No, you could be confident and you should be confident, but don't overdo it, and don't sound arrogant. And specifically, don't use sentences like "this will revolutionize the field," and "this will be a paradigm shift," "this will make an enormous impact." Don't do that. Be a little bit more modest. Specifically, paradigm shifts. I think that's really not the term you should use. And so don't be too boastful. What you should also not do is to make reviewers work and make reviewers infer meaning, such as statements as, well, you can see it is obvious from figure 1 and figure 2 that this and that, or after explaining something, you make the statement, well, it therefore needs no explanation that this and this and that will be true, or this and that follows. Don't do that. Do not make reviewers infer what you are meaning. Just explain clearly and concisely what you are meaning, but don't expect reviewers to infer it. And so again, your style should be completely different compared to writing an academic manuscript. In writing the results of a study for publication, you can go into detail. You will not be punished if you are too long, too verbose, if the tone is too impersonal, etc., etc. But grant writing should be persuasive. You should persuade the reviewer. So you should tell a story and you should take the reviewer along and convince him of your story, and create enthusiasm for your story. And so the style of writing is completely different. And of course, it should be in the future tense and not in the past tense, because the work still needs to be done. And that's obvious. But keep this in mind, that grant writing is completely different from manuscript writing. So what about the most common shortcomings that I see, and of course it's a general finding, and I think everyone will agree on that. And the first thing is that there should be a clear hypothesis. If there's no hypothesis, then your proposal will not stand any chance. What we often see in the era of omics is that there are fishing expeditions being done. So a proposal that states that yeah, we will analyze 20 patients, we will take their tumor tissue, we will perform single cell RNA sequencing, we will do bulk DNA sequencing, whole exome sequencing, and another kind of sequencing with metabolomics, for instance. And then without any clear hypothesis, this is just a fishing expedition, and this will not pass. A second very important aspect is that you need preliminary data. And it's the best proposals and the proposals that have the highest chance for funding have convincing preliminary data. If you have no preliminary data at all, then you're in a very weak position. And even for clinical trial proposals, you can gather preliminary data. It's very common in well-performed large trials to do a pilot study, which is just designed to get an idea of the effect size and of the variation in the effect size, the standard deviation that you can expect, to use that as a basis for your sample size calculation. Another important item that should always be there, and if it's missing, then again, forget it. There should always be a risk analysis and a contingency plan, because you can write that you will do this and that, but there should always be a risk analysis. What can go wrong? And if things go wrong, or things are not going as expected, the animals die too quickly, the patient recruitment is quite bad, what will you do? So you always need a risk analysis and a contingency plan to take care of unforeseen circumstances. Of course, you should take into account ethical aspects. And there is the ethical committee for clinical research in humans. There is the animal ethical committee and ethical regulation in the European Union, which is regulated by several directives. You can find this information easily on all these websites. You should always address sources of bias. For instance, if you use animals, you should make sure that you use 50% male animals, 50% female animals. This is now central, well, not central, but I mean an essential aspect of grant proposals, that you should show that you're sensitive for potential sex-induced bias, and you should take that into account and explain that you will use the two sexes of animals and analyze them separately to see if there is any effect or any interaction with the effect that you're looking at. You should not be overly ambitious or unrealistic. If you have 8 work packages with different experiments, and you only have 2 years to do that, then reviewers will very quickly puncture that balloon. And so don't be too ambitious or unrealistic. Another important point is that you have to convince the reviewer of the expertise of the team. And if you're going to do a clinical study, there must be a statistician. If there's no statistician, forget it. Then that's just not credible, unless you have a Master of Science in Statistics yourself. But a good large clinical trial needs a statistician. The same for artificial intelligence. You need a data scientist. For omics, you need a bioinformatician. So you cannot combine all the expertises, of course, in one person, but at least you should convince the reviewers that you have a team assembled and that this expertise is available somehow. Yeah, an overestimation of recruitment capacity, that's of course quite common in clinical trials. So on this website, you can find information on how you can address issues on gender equality, and a gender equality plan, which is often an obligation and compulsory in European funding. So I would advise you to have a look at that to see how you can include this in your proposal. So what makes a good proposal, and what will really, what kind of proposals will reviewers be enthusiastic about and be positive about? Well, it should tackle an important problem using an innovative approach, and it should really tell a story and captivate and create enthusiasm and curiosity for the reviewer. That will be successful. It should be clear and concise, and I cannot stress enough that most proposals are just too long and are boring to read. So make sure that it's concise. If you have 6 pages, it's really no problem just to use 5 pages. The reviewers will be happy, and they have to read and score a large number of proposals. So the ones who are clear and concise are favored, and that should be obvious. Of course, figures and tables should be used as much as possible. It should be focused, not too general, not too wide in scope, focused. Focused on one hypothesis and 1 or 2 aims, and it should be realistically feasible. So what about the abstract? It should be able to stand alone. And for instance, the European Commission, but also other funders will publish the abstract on their website for the public. This will be publicly available. And it's comparable to a journal manuscript abstract, which should also be able to stand alone. And very often it's all that the reviewers will read. If they read the abstract and they have really grave doubts on whether or not this is a feasible idea, then they will not go further than the abstract. And of course, as you know, an abstract should not contain abbreviations or references or figures or tables. You should not use the first person, and whether or not it should be structured, this depends on the funder. And sometimes it can just be running text without any structure, but usually there is some kind of structure required, such as aims, hypothesis, methods, expected results, relevance, etc., etc. So make sure the abstract is excellent, and usually it's better to write this as the last part of your grant proposal. In the introduction or the background, you should set the context for the proposed work. Why is it important? What is known? What are the known unknowns? What are the unknown unknowns, etc., etc. And it should be supported by contemporary references. Don't refer to papers that are 10 years old. Even 5 years is already quite old. And make sure that the references are from the year where you're submitting the grant proposal and not older. You have to introduce your team, your expertise, your organization, the expertise of the whole team, of the collaborating team, if it's a multinational trial, etc., etc. And then you should introduce your preliminary data. And so I've already stated the importance of preliminary data, both in basic research and in clinical research. However, it must not be too extensive, because if the preliminary data are very, very extensive, then the reviewer might argue, yeah, but why do you need the grant? You've done the work, you've shown what you wanted to show, so why would we fund you? You've already shown it. So you understand there's a kind of a balance between showing too little preliminary data and showing far too much preliminary data. And then the last part of the introduction or the background should be an outline of the structure of the rest of the proposal. Then the aims and the goals should be specified using this SMART acronym. They should be specific, they should be measurable. There must be some way in which the funder can measure whether or not you are reaching those goals. For instance, patient inclusion, the identification of variable X or Y, etc., etc. The goal should be attainable. That means it should be achievable and possible under the expected conditions. So with the budget that is available and the time frame that is available, they should be relevant. The aim should be relevant, and they should be timely. So this means that, again, you should not overestimate the burden and the workload of a proposal, and it should be doable within the period that is allocated. Usually it's 4 years, but it can be shorter and it can be longer. The methods are, of course, the bulk of the proposal. You have to make sure that you use up-to-date methods, that you don't describe techniques which are considered outdated, whether it is in basic or in clinical research. Make sure that you are on the cutting edge of the field. The methods should, of course, be divided into several separate packages. Usually they are called work packages, but sometimes they are called experiments. Like in American applications, it's often described as experiment 1, experiment 2, instead of work package 1 and 2 and 3, etc. Every work package or every experiment should be associated with a deliverable and a milestone. This is important for funders, that they can see what type of milestone do you expect and when do you expect to be able to deliver this milestone. In animal research, it's important that you take into account the regulatory aspects, which can be found back for European funding on the website of the European Commission. Don't forget, and this is often neglected, but also for animal experiments, you need a sample size calculation. And this is important. Don't just state that you will operate on 2 times 20 rats. No, why 20? Why not 5? Why not 100? And so sample size calculation should be done also for animal research. And then there is the ARRIVE 2.0 guidance, which I will show you on the next slide. Risk analysis and contingency plans should be in place. I have already highlighted that or stressed the importance of that part of the proposal. Timing is usually provided in the form of a Gantt chart. And so Gantt is named after a person, and so it's not an acronym. I will show you an example. And for large projects, there should be what is called a PERT diagram, which is an acronym and which shows the general coordination of the project. The next topic is then the data management plan. This is compulsory. You will know that. There should be clearly explained what type of data will be gathered, how the data will be stored, how long they will be stored, how they will be made publicly accessible. Because in the era of open science, in fact, you should make all your research data publicly available after the project has been completed and your publications your work is published. Then you should, in fact, make all your source data publicly available. And this is now expected from scientists. And then usually for the larger projects, there is a statement or a paragraph or even several pages on dissemination and impact. And so this explains how you will disseminate the results, both internally and externally, both within the field and outside of the field to the larger public, and how you will make sure that the results of your project will have an impact on the health of the patients, on the outcome of cancer in these patients, on society as a whole, etc., etc. So these are the ARRIVE guidelines. I have included this in the slide set because I would expect that not all of you are familiar with them, but this is a standard set of guidelines to report animal research. So if you can write in a proposal that you will do all the animal work, taking into account the ARRIVE guidelines 2.0, then this will be a plus. You will charm the reviewers if you know that this exists and that this can be used in order to report your animal research. So how should these different separate work plans or work packages or experiments be formatted? Well, it's easy for the reviewer to always begin it in every work package with a very short summary that is indicated in bold. And in general, you should use highlights using either colored font or a boldface or underlining, but use it sparingly. If of course, every page is full of boldface and color and emphasis and underlinings, then you lose the effect. So use it sparingly. And insert white space. There is nothing that is as intimidating for a reviewer as having to face really what is called a wall of text. Is there a complete A4 page with running text without any white space, without any figure, without any table? This is really horrible. So don't do that. Use structures with bullet points and then sub-bullet points. Word is such a nice software. You can create very beautiful layouts. So do that. And if you don't have the expertise or you don't see it, then ask someone else to do it who has the expertise to make a beautiful presentation. So this is a Gantt chart, which is typically required. It's named after Mr. Henry Gantt. And this shows you the timing of the project. It can also include the milestones and the deliverables. Usually it's made up in Excel software, but there are specific apps for that you can use to generate very professionally looking Gantt charts. So this is a PERT chart, a program evaluation and review technique chart, which is required for the larger grants, for instance, the Horizon 2020 grants, Transcan grants, and this shows you the different work packages, the overall coordination, and then how the different work packages are linked and how information of one work package is used in another work package, etc., etc. And so this is a typical PERT chart that can be used. The data management plan is already highlighted, and so these are all the elements. I will, for the sake of time, I will not go into detail, but make sure that there is a data management plan. Most universities, institutions require that and have an online tool. We have this here at Ghent University, but no doubt most universities have this in place, an online tool to fill in this data management plan. So dissemination and impact is important. This is an example from this PIPEC grant that we submitted, where according to the stakeholder here on the left side, we have formulated objectives, methods, and follow-up metrics that show how the results will be disseminated and how we aim to create an impact using websites, social media, publications, magazines, the EU magazines, outreach to patients, etc., etc. So to finish, some important points regarding proposals that involve clinical trials. Of course, multi-center trials are always favored because doing a large clinical trial originating from only one center, that's not really very credible. You will just not be able to recruit the number of patients that you need. Try to create a consortium with basic scientists and include translational endpoints. In that case, it's really important that you explain in detail how the samples will be obtained, whether or not there is informed consent available, how the samples will be stored, shipped, analyzed, etc., etc. Stick to the guidelines, and there are guidelines for randomized trials. For instance, there is the consort guideline, but for phase 1 and 2 trials, for pragmatic trials, for trials that use artificial intelligence, machine learning, there are different sets of guidelines. So stick to them and mention to the reviewers that you know that they exist and that you will use them. Of course, you should use an endpoint that is clinically relevant. You should provide a realistic effect size hypothesis. For instance, my hypothesis is that with the technique X, I will have a 5% lower chance of cancer recurrence compared to technique Y. This is realistic. If it's 50% or 80%, of course, then you will need a smaller sample size, but this is probably not a realistic effect size. You should include a statistician in large trials, no doubt about it. There should be a data safety monitoring board installed, which should have independent people who can then do an interim analysis to see whether or not the trial should be aborted early because of futility or because of unsuspected unwanted effects, etc., etc. And then very importantly, you should include patient-reported outcomes and quality of life, but also other patient-reported outcomes. And if possible, involve patients in the design of the trial. More and more hospitals and universities now have a patient advisory board that can provide input to your proposal. So in the Equator network, you can find all guidelines, a consort, strobe, agree, arrive here, as already mentioned. If you're looking for a relevant endpoint and you don't know what endpoints you should choose, look at this website, the COMET initiative, core outcome measures in effectiveness trials, but this is only relevant again for clinical trials. Sorry, this is in Dutch, but it's just to show you that our hospital has a patient advisory council for scientific research. And so they are, in fact, part of our clinical trial unit, and it's a patient advisory board. And so, and it gives the opportunity to faculty of the hospital and of the university who want to write a proposal for a clinical trial, they can get the advice of this patient board. So budget calculation should be appropriate and realistic. You should not, of course, go beyond the limit that the funder has set. Usually personnel is the largest cost, and what often is asked is that the institution gives you a cost calculation based on the experience, on the diploma, etc., etc. PhDs are usually easier to get funded than postdocs or technical personnel. And then for clinical studies, don't forget that you will need study personnel, study nurses, for instance. And then you should check with the funder what kind of costs are eligible. So personnel, no problem. But what about laptops, personal laptops for the PhD student? What about travel costs to go to a congress to present your results? What about open access publication? This can be expensive. And I've just seen on Twitter a discussion on the open access fee for a Nature Neuroscience journal. This was 9,500 euros. So this is really horrible, that kind of cost. And so whether or not this is admissible for the funder, you should check in advance. And the same for equipment. If you need a microscope or another piece of equipment for clinical studies, then you should see whether or not this is allowable. So how are proposals evaluated? Well, these are the criteria. They should be significant, they should be novel, they should use state-of-the-art methods, they should be supported by convincing preliminary data, they should be realistically feasible within the time frame that is available, and there should be expertise of the whole team. And this is just for your information, but you can read that. You have the slides, and those are the major criteria for the US NIH grants, but it's largely what I've just said. So if you're awarded the grant, what to do, aside from being in a state of euphoria, which will last a few hours to a few days, of course. First of all, you should check whether or not you got the complete budget, because it depends on the funder, but some funders have the tendency to cut in the budget. They give you half of the budget or 75% of the budget, and yeah, that's not always very nice to get that message, because sometimes you really need the complete budget in order to be able to do or to complete the project. Then you should disseminate, of course. You go to Twitter, you should go to Facebook, the hospital website. Look, we have a major grant. You should prepare the contracts, for instance, with the European Commission. There are a lot of contracts that need to be signed. You should set up a timeline. You should schedule meetings, etc., etc. You have to make, most funders will ask you to have progress reports, so interim reports and then a final report with several types of deliverables and outcomes. And then you should, of course, keep an eye on your budget to make sure that it's not exhausted before the end of the project, or conversely, that you finish the project with a lot of the budget being unused. And then what if you didn't get the grant? Then first of all, of course, don't get disillusioned or don't get depressed, because you're not the only one. And for instance, for the ERC grants, and the European ERC grants, the success rate is 10%. So 90%, and you can assume that all those who submit an ERC grant are not amateurs, and those are top scientists, and only 10% of them get funded. And so give yourself some time to recover from that negative news, and let it lie in the shelf for a few days or a few weeks, and then take it up again. Never give up, and keep applying, and sooner or later you will be successful. And if you've been successful once, you will be successful again. And so don't give up. And of course, if there is feedback from the funder and from the reviewers, read the feedback carefully, and also ask for feedback of the feedback from your colleagues and your peers. And then, of course, if possible, you can ask to resubmit in the next funding cycle. For instance, in the ERC, I think you have 2 chances to submit, but there are other funding channels where you can submit an indefinite amount of times, but that's of course not always very credible. If you do it 4, 5, 6 times, then maybe it's better to choose a different topic. So on that note, I would like to end. I thank you for your kind attention. I will now stop sharing my screen, and if you have any questions, then you are welcome to put them in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wim, thank you so much. Michelle, would you already have some questions in mind?
Yes, I'm just looking to the chat, and there is the ideal question for the end of your talk.
Yeah.
Diego is asking you, if my grant application is denied on agency, should I keep trying with the same topic in another agency? And another question, the same topic, is feedback commonly provided by the committee? And if not, would you advise to try to ask it? I think it's a very good point. It's a very good point trying to improve ourselves, or to find another way to find finance.
Yeah, those are very relevant points. So it depends on the funder. in my experience, most of the funding agencies will provide some kind of feedback, either a general feedback or really the specific feedback by the reviewers, where the strengths and the weaknesses of your proposal are enumerated and evaluated. And if there is no feedback given, you should ask for it. Yeah, I think this is very common, and this is not regarded as impolite or impertinent. No, you should really, after all the work that you've put in, I think it's normal that you get some feedback. And if you don't get it spontaneously, you should ask for it. And this is normal practice and standard practice. And then the question, should you resubmit? Well, this depends on why you were rejected. If the reviewers say, yeah, it's potentially very interesting, but please first gather some preliminary data and then come back, then of course, what you should do is act on that and gather some preliminary data and resubmit. But yeah, it's very much depending on the reasons of the rejection and on the feedback that you get from your colleagues. So if a grant proposal was rejected, then yeah, discuss it with some more senior people who have a lot of experience, and have them read your proposal for an honest appreciation of whether or not a resubmission makes any chance. But of course, if you do resubmit, make sure that you keep in mind the suggestions of the reviewers, and that it's different compared and stronger compared to the previous submission.
Wim Raza is asking if he has a question. Once the funding has been allocated, is it dispersed to the institution or to the lab? Is it worth it to make a separate study account for probably for the team or for the grant who led the grant in whenever you obtain a grant application? What's your advice on this one?
Well, this is usually strictly regulated, and for instance, European funding is not going to you personally. Obviously, there is a contract with the hosting institution, and this, in my case, this would be Ghent University, and Ghent University will open a specific account where the money is then transferred, and either this is transferred all at once, but that's not very common. Usually it's in different installments, and depending sometimes also on specific deliverables. For instance, for clinical trials, some funders demand that your last patient is included before you can get an additional amount of money. But it's always a contract between your hosting institution and the funder. And of course, there is then a specific within the business administration software, like in SAP. You're probably familiar with SAP, and in our environment, we get a budget place within SAP where then the funding is allocated. But this is all strictly regulated and of course also audited by bookkeepers, etc., etc. So there's not a lot of maneuverability there.
And there is another very good question from Diego, which is asking you, my budget was not allocated entirely. So what would, I'm modifying a little bit the question, but this is the meaning. What would be your advice? Change your study, your proposal, and try to make some cuttings in the finance, or try to find another way to find what you are looking for.
Yeah, if it's a major cut in the budget, then what I would do is to contact the funder and explain them that you will not be able to perform the research completely as planned because of the budget constraints, and that you will have to drop, if it's basic research, that you will have to drop 1 or 2 work packages or a number of experiments that you can do, or in clinical trials, that this and that aim or target is not realistically feasible. I think there is no problem in doing that. Contact the funder and ask them, yeah, okay, you give me only part of the budget, but sorry, I need it for this proposal, and unless, of course, you have exaggerated. If you clearly ask too much money for certain costs, then there's no use to go and protest. But if your budget request was reasonable and objective, and you don't get 30% or 50%, then I would argue with the funder that then at least they should allow you to rework the proposal and make sure that it fits then with the budget that you do get. But they will never change their mind, that's for sure.
Just one little point, if you agree, Carmela. In your reviewer experience, how frequent is this? I mean, to make a
downgrade or
limit the budget.
limit.
I mean, the main explanation usually is, oh, you ask for 2 laptops and you will get only 1. Okay, that's not a major problem. But can you give some clue on what is a real life? Because it's quite surprising. You ask for money. If the proposal is good, why to limit it?
Yeah, it depends. For instance, the Flemish Cancer League is quite strict. They regularly cut in the personnel cost. If you ask, for instance, for 2 postdocs and then 1 technical personnel, then they will certainly skip the postdoc, because postdocs are quite expensive, as you know. But it really depends on the funder. And I think about, let's say, 1 in 3 will regularly cut in budgets, and about 2/3 will allow the complete budget, of course, on the condition that the calculation is fair and that you don't exaggerate the numbers that you need.
Okay.
With regards to that, do you usually outsource the person to help you calculate the budget? Because a lot of the doctors are not used to calculating budgets. Do you outsource that? And also, because you mentioned about contracts, do you seek legal advice from your department, from your institution? Do you outsource it? Because if you need to prepare for the contracts ahead of time, or at least have the preparatory discussions for it, how do you look for the resources for the budget computation and legal advice?
Well, that depends, of course, on your environment. But if you're affiliated to a university, then almost always they have a tech transfer office and a legal department, and these contracts are usually standard contracts. So it's not that it needs to be negotiated or whatever, or passing back and forth from one lawyer to the other. It's just a standard contract, but it needs to be signed by the head of the university, by the rector of the university. That's it, in fact. And this is not really something you need to outsource, but for budget calculations, indeed, this can be very tedious, and it's nice if you at least have some help there. And yeah, me personally, I have a postdoc who has quite some skills in doing that, but we also have our clinical trial unit, our EU cell. So we have several sources of support and of help who can do that for you, or at least can give you some examples if you really have to do it yourself. But it's true that you, for large grants, for budget calculations, you need some help to do that. Even if it's to make sure that the money that you ask is realistic, if it's not an underestimation or an overestimation, because that will give a very bad impression.
And then Julia has a question, and also I will follow up with a related question. So how long does it usually take for you to write a successful proposal? And well, if you are somehow new to the experience of writing, let's say, a big international grant, or a big national grant, let's say, how many people do you usually have, probably as a core team of the writers? And my follow-up question to that is, how do you actually start building your consortium when you develop your grant?
Yeah. Well, the consortium is usually something that has grown organically and spontaneously over the years. And those are people that you regularly work together with, like your pathologist, your oncologist, maybe a basic scientist who is interested in translational work. Also a biostatistician. I always work with the same biostatistician, and he's the natural partner for stuff like that. Also in faculty pharmacy, I have collaborators. So that's for local collaborations, and then for international collaborations, yeah, it depends on your field, of course, but look at EYSAC, look at ESSO. All these groups are potential collaborators for grants. And then how to do that in practice? Well, of course, my experience is that if you're the promoter, if you're really the one who will coordinate, then the main writing burden will be on you, and you can hope that everyone else will share some of the burden, but usually you will get disappointed and you will have to do all the work. That's how it works. And what I do is I use SharePoint, for instance. I put the proposal on SharePoint. I ask everyone to fill in his comments or his, but what you usually need from collaborators is very specific factual information, like their CV, the budget that they need, the experiments that they can do. But for writing a proposal, it's important that the style is consistent. And if different parts of a proposal are written by different people, if the introduction is written by someone different than the discussion, well, not the discussion, but other parts, then this really will show. So I think it's better that you write the bulk of the material yourself, and that you can ask them to proofread it. And sometimes that's very useful. They can point to you to typos that you missed even after 5 or 6 times reading the same document. And then the workload, it depends on how fluent you are in writing scientific English. I've read, when preparing this talk, I've read the standard advice of having 2 weeks per page. But I must say that I write a little bit quicker. And I think it's possible to write even a complete 6-page proposal in a few days. It depends on how prepared you are and how well the ideas are present in your head. But yeah, if you are really a novice and you have no experience at all with grant writing, just ask help of your colleagues, of your more senior colleagues. They will usually be very happy to help you and have a first proof read of your work. But it's yeah, it takes a big amount. What is the most frustrating part is that if you are in multinational collaborations and the deadline is approaching, you have to keep sending reminders, hoping that they will, but everyone comes up with their information last minute. And so there's always a last minute stress. I always try to avoid it and submitting the proposal 1 day ahead, but usually it's not possible. And it's a risk because everyone has the same problem and everyone submits at the last minute. And then the server gets overloaded, and then you fail to submit it. So that's the practicalities of submission of grants. But on the other hand, if it's successful, then it's of course a very rewarding experience. Yeah.
Michelle, do you have some additional?
Yes, plenty of questions. But I hope we'll get some other very big. We have very good questions from the people that are hearing to you. One of my preoccupation, I don't know. You told us, and I guess it's very right, that most reviewers will not be specialists in the field. And my concern is, in fact, this is a major problem for surgical research. Yeah. It's not such a problem for basic science research and for clinical medical oncology, but for surgical in general, in surgery in general, and surgical oncology in particular, it is. So, what would be your advices to try to avoid the problems, or try not to be considered of a a second range proposal or so on?
Yeah, well, of course, you should make sure that it will appeal also to an oncologist or a gastroenterologist by, yeah, for instance, proposing multi-modal therapy, like combinations of surgery with chemotherapy, with radiotherapy, neoadjuvant, adjuvant. So those projects will certainly not pose a problem. And if your proposal is really focusing on surgical technique or imaging or whatever, then make sure that they get enthusiastic about it by avoiding details and jargon, like they will not know what a complete mesocolic excision is. They will not know what total mesorectal excision is. So no need to describe that in detail because they've never seen an abdomen from the inside. So let alone that they can imagine what you're talking about. So if it's really a surgical proposal, then you should hope that your proposal is reviewed by a surgeon, and if not, that he or she will see the significance and understand the significance. But then again, don't go into detail and try to work as much as possible with figures and visualizations, because that makes it easier to understand what you're talking about. But yeah, it's not so easy to get surgical scientists and proposals from surgeon scientists funded, and that's why I think you should focus on multimodal treatments or strong translational aspects, like immunology of lymph nodes. There's a lot of things you can do, and we are, of course, in the unique position that we have access to the samples. We have our hands on the tumor. And this is, in fact, something that the basic scientists envy us for. The fact that we have our hands on the material, on fresh material. And so you should exploit that. So you have the possibility to do single cell sequencing, stuff like that. And then make sure that you are an essential partner and an indispensable partner in the whole consortium.
I personally like what you said about the style of writing, that it has to captivate the reviewers, and it has to tell a story. And I guess it's something that we usually forget because we're more used to the manuscript style of writing, but the approach to writing a grant is, as you have pointed out, completely different.
I agree.
So this is something I learned something new I learned today, and I will really remember this. I also am quite interested about your view about the difference in the types of grants that are approved in the US or in the UK. Do you have you noticed the differences in terms of the priorities of funders from the US or from the UK? And probably what could you advise if you're European? How likely is it that we can actually apply for a US organization, for example?
Well, I must admit that I have no personal experience in submission of grants. I have been a reviewer for the SSO, Young Investigator grants, but of course, these are relatively minor grants compared to the big NIH grants. And I have the impression that the reviewing process is quite fair in the sense that I don't think that you will be put automatically at a disadvantage because you are from outside the US.
Yes. Okay.
But of course, you have to compete with institutions like Harvard and Yale, and the competition will be tough. But I don't think that there are other criteria, or I think it's just the scientific excellence, the novelty, the significance. It's present there in the slide that I've not shown in detail, maybe, but you can look at it, the criteria that the NIH is using.
Yeah.
And it's in fact very similar to my experience with European funding. And then for the UK, I think it's probably similar, but I must admit that I have very little experience with UK funding mechanisms.
There is a new question from from Diego.
Maybe he's writing a grant. So.
But yeah, I guess he was disturbed by your explanation about your your proposal on PPAC, and he's asking you if it is not the time to organize everyone own proposal on COVID, but not on on PPAC, and the time frame is not so good from oncology or from regular oncology, and because a lot of money is going to COVID and so on, and it may be for a long period. So do you have advice for him? Keep on going with PPAC, or change your mind?
Yeah, but I'm not
Kidding
sure
you.
I understand the question. I will read it myself. Should we keep thinking about grant?
Maybe
yes, well, I understand your question, Diego, now that I've read it as well. And no, I think you should not be scared off by the fact that a lot of money is going into COVID research. I mean, it's now the third year of COVID, and we don't have to.
It's going down.
I think so. Yeah. We'll go back to oncology.
Yeah, what I've mentioned was a really very specific case, and of course, a lot of people are successful, and we should submit as much as possible, as many grant proposals as possible, and regardless of the COVID epidemic.
And besides, I mean, cancer is a longer term issue that we must solve. I mean, I hope COVID will stop, but the problem of cancer is there, and it's probably growing. So I feel like as surgeons, we have even more opportunities now to apply for grants, especially with what you said a while ago about increasing priorities within the EU, at least, for funding surgical projects. So I think it's worth to highlight that the SO has done a lot of efforts on this, and we must take advantage, I think, for surgeons to apply for grants.
I agree. Yeah. Okay.
I don't see additional comments, but I hope Diego, who has sent us a lot of questions, I hope that you'll be successful in your grant application. And yeah, thank you. And he also conveys his gratitude for addressing a lot of the questions. And I'm so sure that all our audience, a lot of young surgeons, have been enlightened by a very practical approach that you have provided us when it comes to writing grants. I learned a lot as well. Michelle, and last word.
You give a lot of advices, and in your slides there are a lot of references, and we are able with it to find our way. So it was I agree with this, very practical and very open-minded. It's also high level. I mean, it's from a small level. I mean, if somebody can do a big thing, it can only also do a little thing, and you try to explain us every aspect, and it was very good and very clear, and your slides are really very good. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.